In 1971, just a year after I had trained to be a teacher myself, I was working in a teacher training college in Ghana in West Africa. And one day I went to a village to observe some of the third year students on their teaching practice. Yes, and I saw something that actually was, it shocked me. And that was it was at playtime, and I just saw a boy with a big sort of notice, cardboard notice around his neck, which said, "I am a fool, I spoke vernacular." Now, I think it's clear that one should never ever call any child ever a fool. Just awful. And vernacular, of course, is the word they were using for their local language. Fanti it was called. And he had been speaking Fanti. And to be called a fool for speaking your home language is dreadful. I mean, what's it saying to that child about himself, his culture, his family? Now, this was 1971. The head teacher was doing his best. He was approaching retirement, so he had been brought up in, had gone to a school, actually quite a good school in Ghana, that was run by British missionaries, and this is what they had done to him. So he thought he was providing the best possible education for the children in his school. Oh dear. Very worrying. I was working in a secondary school, and Tariq arrived, newly arrived, not a word of English. So I turned to Kaban and I said, "Kaban, please can you tell Tariq that he's going to come to my special class tomorrow morning?" And Kaban turned to Tariq and he said, "You're going to go to Mr. Ward's special class tomorrow." No, I said, "Can you say it in Urdu?" Kaban was mortified. I can't speak Urdu in front of the class. I had to take him into the corridor before he would speak Urdu. Both of those stories are really worrying because they are showing attitudes towards pupils' first languages, towards their cultures, towards their families, towards them as human beings. If we don't accept a child's first language, we're not accepting that child. And if we don't accept that child, they're not going to thrive. As you're already watching my videos, it probably means that you agree with me that we should be using children's first languages in order to recognise their humanity, their background, their lives, recognise them. But some teachers may not be convinced. So what do we say to them? Most people think of languages as being completely separate. And here's my little diagram that shows that. L1 means first language, and L2 is the second language, which in our case would be English. They're touching because they do the same job, but actually there's no overlap between them, or very little. I mean, we know French and English have got a lot of overlap, but when we think of English and Urdu, or even more, English and Mandarin, we think of them as completely separate. And it's quite natural for us to think, well, there's only room for one of those languages in our heads. And of course we know, unless you're Welsh, of course, in which case you think there's room for two, English and Welsh. And of course we know that English, or English and Welsh, are the languages that are needed for us to progress and to get good SATs results. So we concentrate, possibly rightly, on those languages, on English in particular. But what if children's first languages could help children's development of English? So here's my diagram again. But what if these two triangles were not actually completely separate? Maybe they're like an iceberg, and underneath these two separate triangles there's a whole load here of CUP, and CUP stands for Common Underlying Proficiency. So I was sitting at my computer thinking, what on earth does common underlying proficiency mean? And then I just wrote down counting. I mean, if I've got that concept of 1, 2, 3, then I can look at it in another language. Ning, song, sam, si. You see, I can easily do that easily. My pronunciation was awful. That was supposed to be Thai. But I've got to have that concept of counting in my own language before it will work in another. And then the difference between one and first and two and second. If I've got that concept in one language, in my then I can look for it in another language. And it's having those deep concepts that helps. And I've got things like, well, how about comparing? If I know bigger than, smaller than, then how do you say that in German? How do you say it in Mandarin? It's got, having the concept first helps you do the things. And all sorts of other things like predicting it's going to happen. I wonder if, that hypothesizing. And what about those practical things like how do you develop suspense and excitement in your language? So I realised I was writing down all the higher level language skills. And if you've developed them in one language, it's so much easier to develop them in a second language. So getting kids to develop any of those skills in one language helps the other language. If we allow that translation, in order to translate from one language into another, you've really got to understand it. So if you want kids to really understand your language, get them to translate it from English back into their first language. And that will really cement everything they've learned so much more quickly than anything else. It's an amazing thing. And so children's first languages turn out to be an amazing learning tool. So I do recommend use children's first languages in your teaching. I'll say a couple of stories. I was in community college, and there was it was in one of their all-boy classes they had at the time. You could choose an all-girl class or an all-boy class or a mixed class. Well, it happened to be an all-boy class I was in. And there was something going wrong. And so in a science lesson, so I turned to this first boy and I said, what's the word for reflection in Gujarati? Well, he didn't know, so I asked the second boy. No, he didn't know. Third boy didn't. The fourth boy gave me a word. Now, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could remember the word, but I can't. Anyway, I carried it for half a second all the way across the classroom and asked the boy on the other side and said, what's the meaning of this word in English? And he said, shadow. Shadow. No wonder the children were getting confused. They didn't really understand the concept of reflection properly. So we backtracked, retaught reflection, and of course things were so much better after that. So you can use the children's first language in your teaching even if you don't share a language with them. Ah, yes. So my foster son Trung came up to me and said, please Dad, can you help me? Well, of course I'm a wonderful father, so I said yes. And what had happened was he'd failed his HND. Well, he'd passed the exams. I have no idea how, but he had. But he'd failed the project which he had to do to get the degree. So, of course I'll help you, Trung. What's it about? Yes, it's about stress and strain in the slave cylinder of a mini brake system. I know what a mini is. It's that small car I bang my head on when I get in. I know what the brake is. It's the middle pedal that stops the car. I'm not absolutely sure what a brake cylinder is. I'm sure I ought to know, but I don't. I have never before or since heard of a slave cylinder. No idea what that is. Most important of all, I don't know the difference between stress and strain. Really important engineering concepts. Of course I'll help you, Trung. So I said, let me read your project. Oh my goodness me. It was awful. It was written in Vietnam English. So just a jumble of nonsense. So I said to him, Trung, can you translate that first sentence in your project? And he said, what? Can you translate the first sentence in your project? But Dad, you don't understand any Vietnamese. Well, no, I don't, but can you translate it? Are you sure? Yes, Trung, I'm sure. Yes, I'm sure. Eventually he translated it. He got halfway through the sentence and he said, it doesn't make any sense, does it? No, Trung, it doesn't. Oh, what on earth was going on? Well, the thing is, at the back of our heads there's a little green man there with a typewriter, and It's our monitor, and it monitors that we're making sense. And he's got one at the back of his head. It only speaks Vietnamese. So when he translated his English into Vietnamese, the little monitor there said, "No, rubbish." But of course he couldn't see that when it was just in English. And the good news is that Trung did pass the HND and was very proud of himself. So just a couple of little stories that show you ways of using the pupils' first languages. You don't have to speak a word, but there are hundreds of ways of getting kids to use it. Just translate the story. I had one child go away and just translate this into the microphone on a tape recorder. Just all sorts of things you can do. Just getting two kids to talk to each other in their first language. Getting them, here's a bit of English, you translate it for your friend. And that activity alone costs you nothing in time preparation or hardly anything, but really is demanding from them. And because they're using their first language, often, not always, but often they'll really want to be doing that and being successful. So use the children's first language as a powerful learning tool. If you have a copy of Racing to English, then you can get a little bit more information about using pupils' first languages in the advice document. So go to Staff Info, then click on Advice Documents, and finally you can see something called Bilingualism. That's the document you want to read. There's half a dozen pages and includes a couple of pages of practical activities that you might be able to use with your pupils.